Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the Product Design Podcast. For those of you who don't know or couldn't guess by the title, this is a series of talks where I will essentially be picking the brains of industry experts, exploring different topics within product and design. And here with me today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Stefan Fritzemeier. So, the topics that we will be exploring in today's podcast is number one, the value of product owners, business analysts, and requirements engineers. And number two, the tensions between the developers and the business side of the company, where you're bridging the gap between these two and coming to a common ground. So at the end of the podcast, we will discuss and find out exactly what the value is of product owners, business analysts, and requirements engineers. But firstly, Stephen, again, pleasure to have you on here today. Please, could you start by giving a quick overview of yourself and your career so far?
Sure. Hi, Anna. Thanks for
Hello,
having me.
you're more than
Um,
welcome.
yeah. So it's a great opportunity for me to talk a little bit about my whole, what basically my whole career, or what the topic is of my whole career, you could say.
Yeah.
Uh, and I've been now working for over 10 years in the IT industry.
Hmm.
Started out as a software engineer, so on the technical side.
Yeah.
Although I studied, business information systems, which is like combination of business administration and computer science.
Hmm.
I still chose to start in the practical part, let's say, as a software engineer.
Yeah.
And early on, I had the opportunity to work in China and live there for 3 years, which was fantastic
Nice.
experience, of course, and learned a lot there, and was also kind of yes, not only a software engineer, also a little bit business analyst at that time, requirements engineer,
Hmm.
what you like to call it. And then later on, I came to Switzerland and started my career here at a company where I had the opportunity to really work for different on projects for different bigger Swiss companies
Hmm.
that have really highly complex IT environments, and I learned a lot there. Also
Hmm.
started as a software engineer, but quite quickly changed the role, actually, because I had the
Yeah.
opportunity to try a project as a business analyst or
Hmm.
requirements engineer, and I was I liked that a lot. It was a little less, coding, sitting at the computer and coding, a little
Hmm.
more talking to people,
Yeah.
um, and so I liked that a little bit more. So I kept on that track
Hmm.
and was working as a business analyst and later on product owner um, for the rest of my career. And still today,
Hmm.
working for a startup in insurance or insurtech area
Hmm.
as a product owner, and it's really it has been a very interesting career for until now. Gets more interesting
Yeah.
now that I now that I have met you and we're doing a podcast.
Oh, lovely.
Very
Well, it's quite,
exciting.
thank you so much for that. I think it's fair to say that you've had, quite a journey throughout your professional career. I think what's really interesting here is that you have experience, obviously, with the first topic we're going to discuss, in terms of now being a product owner. You started out as a software engineer, on top of that, worked as a business analyst. So your insight, could be coming from different angles because obviously you've been within those different positions throughout your career.
Mhm.
So yeah, in saying that, I mean, I'd love to kind of hear your insight as a product owner because I know that you have extensive field within that department. I guess from an outsider's perspective looking in, it would be fair to say it looks like a straightforward process in terms of getting a product out to production. But what is sort of the ins and outs of that process from the perspective of a product owner?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what we talked before about was this joke in this movie Office Space, and
Yes.
you might remember, and laughed about it. I mean, it's a great joke. It's this scene where, I mean, for those who don't know it, it's a movie from the end of the 90s, I think, about a standard IT company
Hmm.
in America in the 90s with with all these cliches and memes.
Hmm.
and and of course there is a truth to everything, and this one scene is about requirements engineers, because there
Hmm.
is this this guy interviewed by the, let's say, McKinsey, who try to find people who are not, if who are not valuable for the company, who are not
Hmm.
efficient or who don't provide value to the company. And the thing that he says is, I take the so they ask, what are you doing here? And he says, I
Hmm.
take the specification from the business to the software developers.
Hmm.
And this sounds, as you said, very straightforward.
Yeah, it does
and
indeed.
and I have rewatched the scene recently, and actually he even says his secretary is doing the actual work. So that's even worse. So I have the feeling that this is a perception of this role.
Yeah,
I mean, it is funny because everyone can relate to that a little bit,
yeah.
and this might be, what some people think from the outside. Okay, but what are you actually doing? And we
Hmm.
just, why don't business people directly talk to the developers?
Yeah.
And I mean, since my career is in this job, I have a, I, I also, I mean, I like the joke because it's funny, but I also think it's not quite true,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Um, I do think that we provide a lot of value actually,
Mm.
and maybe the main, let's say, the main issue or the main problem space that we are working on as product owners or requirements engineers
Hmm.
is the gap between business side and
Yeah.
customer side and IT
Hmm.
side, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, this is even wider today, or let's say in recent years, where companies, especially, so I know it from Switzerland, but I assume it's also in other countries like UK or Germany or so,
Hmm.
where you have the software teams nearshoring, right? Nearshored.
Yes. Hmm.
So in Eastern Europe or even further in Asia, offshored, right? So basically, you have the gap anyway between business and IT already,
Hmm.
right? From the alone from the topics that they talk about, from the knowledge, from the skill set,
Yeah.
from what they want. I think I will talk about that later on.
Hmm.
But also, in addition, you have this cultural and socialization gap that is between completely
Yes.
different cultures, and
Yeah.
also everything else like economical differences and language barriers and all these things, right? So the
Hmm.
gap is even wider if you have development teams that are offshore,
Yeah.
which is really a common case. I have this, throughout all my projects or jobs. And basically, there was a team, at least one team that was outsourced like that, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, so it's really common, and that, as I said, that widens this gap that is anyway there.
Hmm.
And when I talk about business side, I mean, of course, not only these internal stakeholders that are,
Yeah.
the maybe business representatives, sales representatives, people like
Hmm.
that, but also the end customer, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
which can be internal, if you're a huge company and you build so internal tools, can be internal customer, but also, of course, the external consumer, and the the basic value for the business.
Hmm.
That is for me the business side, and then you have the IT side, where I mean developers, testers, operations, everything that belongs creating a software
Mm-hmm.
basically and running it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I, also, I read this study, it's a PVC study.
Right.
I mean, you probably know this. They do it every, I don't know, not every year, nearly every year. This
Mm-hmm.
global digital survey where they
Okay.
ask
Yes. Yeah.
business leaders. Yeah, so a few years ago, this was really interesting because they found exactly this gap that I was describing, right? This
Right.
because the IT leaders they said we the problem is not that the technology is not there, but the problem
Mm.
is rather that there is a lack of collaboration between business and IT. That's one
Yeah.
part.
Uh-huh.
So it's exactly this. You cannot just take the specification or requirements and you know
Yeah.
hold them over the fence to the developer
Yeah.
and then hope that software comes back, right?
Yeah.
And the software that you wanted comes back.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
then yeah, and so they found that this was the main reason why software projects failed, right?
Oh, wow.
Instead of maybe technology not working or something like that, you know?
Yeah. That's so interesting. There was a
Yeah,
study on that. I mean, was that recent as
exactly.
well, or?
I mean, the one that I when I basically was researching that part, I that was 2017.
Ah, I
This IT
see.
report.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
it has been, yeah, now it has been 5 years, but
Mm.
I really think since I'm still working in that area,
Yeah,
I really still feel that that's the case, you know.
that is the case. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
wow, that's
Um,
really interesting to kind of hear. And obviously, as we
yeah.
mentioned there, sort of the bridging of the gap between the two, and the fact that that gap was identified as well. And you yourself as
Mm,
a product owner experiencing that, I guess you could say, kind of push and pull between those two contrasting sides. I guess you could say as a part to opposing, because obviously the main aim is for you guys to come to meet a common ground to present a product of value, essentially, which is very interesting. I liked obviously the joke you mentioned at the start. Very true. um, that's kind of how outsiders, I guess you could say, looking in, may view the situation, which is
mhm.
why I was really interested to have this talk with you on this podcast today, to kind of hear insight and shed light on the fact that actually, if only it were as straightforward as going from A to B, etc. But there's so many sort of elements to take into sort of context. So how do you see this kind of moving forward? And in terms of kind of bridging the gap between the two. Obviously, you need a middleman in the situation. I guess it'd be fair to say in this situation, obviously, is your product owner. So, say if you were to remove that from the equation, how would that kind of impact on processes? From your perspective.
Yeah, so I think that's the point, right? You need a middle, and
Mm,
um, also the reason is that you have developers that really should actually focus on developing, right? And
hmm.
the thing is, there is a tension between business and IT,
Yeah.
but I think it's not a bad thing, right? That you have
Okay.
this tension because you have, as you said, the push and pull is actually, I think it's not a bad thing per se. You just have to, yeah, use it right.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, if there was no tension, in the world, then I guess there would be nothing of value, right? I mean,
That's very true. Yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah,
agree with that. Mm.
because there is this, maybe this quote from this philosopher.
Hmm.
He said, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room." Right?
Yes, yes, very familiar. That is the perfect one to use.
Yeah, exactly, right. So that's exactly the point, right? If there were there was no tension, nothing would happen. So in
Absolutely.
in general, I think it's not per se a bad thing. Although we humans always want to relieve the tension, right? That's
Yeah.
always the goal.
Naturally, yeah.
Yeah, naturally, exactly. But and it is also true here. But it's important to do it in the right way because imagine also imagine there was no tension between business and IT because the developer the developers don't want to create the most beautiful code and the most wonderful design patterns, or
Mm-hmm.
or if the business side wouldn't want to maximize the customer value
Mm-hmm.
from the developed software,
Yes.
then either the software would
Mm-hmm.
never be finished because the engineer is doing this happy engineering,
Yeah.
like I will build the most beautiful thing, but it will never be finished, or I don't care when it's finished.
Yeah.
Uh, or it doesn't actually solve the customer's problem, right? It's just a cool
Yeah.
thing to build, but it doesn't
Mm.
or it's not useful for the customer.
Yeah.
Um, or on the business side, the software is maybe if only the business side gets its stake, right? Then then maybe the software is deliver too quickly.
Yeah.
It still has a lot of bugs. It is not usable.
Mm.
Maybe it doesn't work technically because the developer didn't have time to
Yeah.
use the correct design patterns or build a good architecture and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So both sides, need to go in their direction a little
Yes.
bit,
I
although
agree.
the directions might not always align, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
always because, oh, I need the software on Monday, but the developer says, no, I cannot build a good written code until then, right?
Mm-hmm.
For example. And then who decides or who finds the best way then to go forward? And that is, I think, a good job for the requirements engineer, the business analyst, or product owner, even more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the product owner also has the power to decide,
Yeah.
actually,
Holds
which
a
is a very
decision. Yeah.
important thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's that's why I think that this role is really a good mediator, or let's say middleman or whatever,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
middlewoman, to decide, or to bring compromise, kind of, yeah.
Yes.
You need to talk to both parties,
Yeah.
and kind of, and you need to um, make sure that you, with the resources that you have, with the time that you have, that you build something valuable and useful that is actually being used and actually working. Yeah.
Definitely. I really like, when you pick it apart in that way, I completely agree with your point in terms of you need both kind of perspectives,
Mm.
in order to put something together of value, as you've mentioned. So you can't operate with just one side. So it's really interesting the way that you kind of divided and dissected it in that way. I think it just makes logical sense. And then obviously having the middleman being obviously your product owner, business analyst, requirements engineer, to come to that sort of happy medium, and because the end result is essentially produce something of value. So yeah, I really
Mhm.
kind of agree with that structure. I mean, firstly, saying going back to kind of having the middleman within the process, I know you mentioned there sort of product owner, business analyst, and requirements engineer. Now, just for people that may not be as informed in terms of the kind of positions of what they play within a company. I know we've seen a lot of we have job titles which kind of mean the same thing. So could you just define sort of either the difference or the roles exactly of your product owner, business analyst, and requirements engineer within that process that you've just outlined?
Sure. I mean, that's always, that has always been a cause for discussion, or let's say, yeah, people were unsure. Okay, what does this role actually entail in this
Yeah.
company, because it can be different in the other company.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
especially, business analyst. If you take that name,
Hmm.
business analyst can be a lot of things. Mm, but in the IT area, um, it's usually the same as the requirements engineer, I would say.
Okay.
And it's basically you write the specific, or you your end product is probably the specification that you write for the
Mhm.
software that's to be
Mhm.
created, right? But of course, you need to talk to all the, as I said, the business side, the business stakeholders, create compromise. You need
Mhm.
to talk to the developers, to the architects, and so on,
Mhm.
to create a specification that is that the developers actually understand and is not, ambiguous and so on.
Mhm.
So of course that's a very difficult part because there are many ways to make mistakes there, to or to omit things where you think, okay, this should be clear, in your subconscious it's clear, but the other person who reads the same specification, maybe
Yes.
being far away from another continent or whatever, has a
Mm.
completely different way of seeing the world. Then
Mhm. Yeah,
that's why,
definitely.
yeah, it can, and then yeah, there are misunderstandings, and the software that built is not the right thing, and then you have to go back in another loop and
Mm.
build it differently and so on. So there, I think is the requirements engineer or the business analyst's job
Mhm.
to really create specification and to make, yeah, to that actually results in everyone understanding the same thing,
Okay.
everyone involved, right? And also, they have you have this communication to the business side, which
Yep.
maybe sometimes needs other ways than with the
Mhm.
developers, right? So
Right. That makes sense.
I like to work with images, or where I draw something, a diagram, a very easy diagram that can be understood by all sides.
Mhm.
That is usually the best, for example, to illustrate complex processes, or behaviors of the software, or whatnot. Mm,
Mhm.
there are certain, yeah, easy ways to make it still, unambiguous, but still easy to understand.
Yeah.
Uh, so, for example, those things, right? And the in addition, you have the maybe I should add one more thing, that
Sure.
there is a solution designer role as well,
Okay.
which sometimes sometimes the requirements engineer is called solution designer, or solution designer is an additional role, or the work of the requirements engineer also entails solution design, which is really even more technical. So it's basically closer to the developer
Right.
because they design the solution on the technical level, right? So
Mhm.
the requirements engineer gets the requirements. What should the software do, or what should the result be? But
Mhm.
then how to get there technically, right?
Yeah.
This is basically what the solution designer is doing. So
Ah.
he is really only, let's say, talking to the developers and architects instead of because the business requirements should then be clear, right?
Mm.
From the
Oh
At that
wow.
point. So yeah, this
Quite a
is
lot
an
of
addition.
factors to yeah, another
Yeah, yeah,
addition into the
exactly,
equation.
exactly. So this is also something that the requirements engineer or business analyst is tasked to do sometimes. Yeah,
Oh
if he has the
wow.
technical background, then this can be part of it.
Oh
Yeah, and
wow.
then I mean the more common, or the now more common role, or more known role, is the product owner, I guess, right?
Yes, yeah.
So it's really covers basically all that the business analyst is doing, I would say.
Mm. Okay.
Uh, Sometimes you have such big teams that you have both, right? That you have
Right.
product owner, but you have also business analysts or
A
requirements
business
engineers
analyst. Yeah.
in the project, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, who is writing specifications and doing all that, what he's doing.
Mhm.
But the product owner, um, at least how I was doing, how I was, the jobs that I had as a product owner, they always had everything. So
Mhm.
all the business analyst tasks, but also in addition, the project management tasks,
Right.
at least from IT perspective, right? So you had a business side, a project manager from the business side as well, who is like overall project manager. But
Right.
from the IT side, you also need someone to plan the resources, right? The
Yeah.
developing resources, testing resources, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Who is doing the time planning? Um, based on estimations of the developers on the effort. Then you, as a product owner, you need to make decisions on prioritization. What should we
Mm-hmm.
do? What needs to be done first, and so on. Plan
Yeah.
the releases. What should be in the next release,
Mm-hmm.
and all this, with the time plan, and then, communicating that to the business side.
Wow,
And
there's a lot that goes into that.
yeah, there's a lot in addition.
A lot, yeah.
Yeah,
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 absolutely. I mean, just you saying that and you're speaking from experience, it kind of links back
yeah,
to our very original, point that we raised at the start to where, it's not as straightforward as a process, to get from one place to the other. There's so many
absolutely.
contributing factors. Yeah, it's like if you
Yeah,
had a funnel, there's so much that goes into it before you can come out with the end product. And it's interesting to
exactly.
hear you sharing your insight from experience. So, is it fair to say, the position of your product owners, business analysts, and requirements engineer in this equation that we've outlined, they are the middle men or women in the process? Obviously, they have different roles, to serve within that equation. But in some cases, like you mentioned, you see companies that have a product owner and a business analyst or requirements engineer, or in your case, obviously being a product owner, you obviously had to cater to each of those different responsibilities within that equation.
Yeah, exactly. And the the product owner, he, as the name says, right, he owns the product, which means he
Yeah.
is also responsible, ultimately, for this
Yes.
product, or yeah, for this, let's say, software product, right?
Mm.
Um, and I mean, that can mean in the end that you have to, um, you have to do the deployment, or you have to do the write the last lines of code. I don't know, sometimes it can happen, if no one is,
Yeah.
if you ultimately you're responsible, and also during operate, other when if the product is live,
Mm.
also during that time, at least in where I was working, the product owner was also responsible still then, right, for the running software. So if
Ah.
product, if issues happen on production, you
Mm.
immediately have to handle that. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it depends. Of course, there are many product owner roles in big companies that may be a little different. Where you have more work distribution, right? More people to help him with some
Yes.
tasks, for example,
Hmm.
right? But yeah, but yeah, that is really, it really means you own the product and have to take care that customers can use it, and that it's valuable and working. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, yeah,
It's a lot.
and
There's a lot
yeah,
that goes into it.
it is. Yeah, and I mean, this is the main issue in software development is it's a complex task.
Mm.
Not only complicated. So I have the, maybe this differentiation.
Yes.
Complicated means, okay, it is complicated process, but you can define it, and you can uh, describe it,
Mm.
and it doesn't change. But
Yeah.
complex is really, it's it is complicated, but it's also dynamic. So
Mm.
it changes dynamically.
Yeah.
The requirements change. Then you have a lot of factors, right? The software developers, maybe they make a mistake. Maybe the product owner makes a mistake in describing the requirements.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe he misunderstood something from the business side. and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So a lot of things, and then there are changing requirements that can be from external side. I don't know, the law changes, or the customer wants something else suddenly, things like that. It's so dynamic, so it's really,
Mm.
and then software. A lot of the software platforms you build it on, they change. They have a bug. They have whatever,
Yes.
huge
Yeah, that's another
uh,
thing to consider.
problems can come from the. So there's really a lot of the that this process entails, and it's not a it is really not a simple problem to solve software development.
Yeah.
That's why I think there is this role, a product owner or
Mm.
business analyst, really important
Yes.
uh,
In the
to um,
process. To
to
make it run
handle this
smooth.
complexity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Someone, every all the people involved need to handle the complexity. But
Mm.
I think especially the product owner, he needs to, as you said, the funnel, right?
Yes.
He has all the chaos
Mm-hmm.
and needs to make it digestible for all the people involved.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously, to get to that point, there's a lot of processes and hurdles, no doubt, and obstacles that you have to overcome. Like you
Mm.
mentioned there, communication is key, making sure that it's interpreted to where, the developers, understand the requirements or the plan, clearly, and the same on obviously the business side of things. So, obviously, you're carrying a lot of the decisions there, and obviously ensuring that on both sides things are running smoothly. So in saying that, from your perspective, what was sort of the main challenge you faced in that kind of situation throughout your working career, and how did you overcome that, or what was useful to allow you to overcome that and come to a resolution?
Oh, that's a interesting question. um, so I guess, I mean, I had a lot of challenges, surely,
Yeah, no doubt.
all all the time. But yeah, it's I guess quite recently, last year, I think that was that was a huge challenge,
Mm,
because we had, the thing was that the business side
mm,
promised something, or promised a
mm.
lot of things in the
Right.
contract,
Okay.
which is even worse.
Yeah,
And
that is, if it's there written, yeah.
exactly. And then this contract was already written before I
Mm,
joined company,
okay.
was already signed and so on. And
Yeah.
when I joined, I was suddenly responsible for this project. And
Right.
then, okay, we found quickly that we cannot deliver all these things so
Mm-hmm.
quickly as they wanted them, right?
Right.
So it was a total, yeah, it was really a challenge to, still make the partner happy,
Mm.
um, from IT side, because we were really put in front of a kind of an impossible situation where we had
Okay.
to, okay, yeah, basically, of course, we can only deliver a small part of what our business side promised the
Mm.
customer, the partner.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then important is that you cut as I said, right, that you prioritize, and then you need to really rigorously cut things out.
Yes,
You
I can
know,
imagine.
you need to go back to, okay, what does the end customer actually want on and
Mm.
need, and
Yeah.
how can we create, um, in this short time, create software that does its job
Mm.
from the end customer's perspective,
Yeah.
but maybe in the background a few things are not yet working,
Yeah.
are still manual, everywhere where we could save time and
Mm-hmm.
development resources. We first cut it out, for the release time, the release date, right?
Okay.
So it was really a tough situation, because you had to tell this to the partner, who was expecting much
Yes.
more, and
Yeah.
at the same time making hard decisions to cut stuff out and
Mm,
move it to later. And then when you cut stuff out, of course, you have to change the solution a little bit here and there
mm,
because the original plan is not yet implemented. So you need to find other ways to solve it.
mm, hmm.
Uh, yeah, and that was really tough. And then, after 2 months that I joined, we really, so it was
Wow.
not much time. And
Not at all. Two
yeah,
months. That's a
2 months,
very
yeah,
short space
really
of
short.
time.
Yeah, I mean,
Wow.
there was already a few things were already there, right? So
Mm,
there was the basis of the software was there, and
yeah.
the of the front end part and the core part was also basically there, but
Hmm.
still a lot of things had to be done, and the specification was, all over the place, was not yet
Yeah.
really streamlined to what we needed to do. Yeah.
Mm,
So yeah, in the end, the release was good. The release was successful. It was a working
good.
software, but of course, a lot of things
Wow.
were still missing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's to be, expected within that time, but that's very
exactly.
impressive within that
Yeah,
space of time as well. And the fact that obviously you were placed in, I guess you could say, a tricky position.
yeah, very tricky.
Yeah. So, I guess it's being a product owner then, obviously you'll specialize in that field. Is it more so of being able to kind of obviously rationally and quickly identify these different issues? Say, the fact that you had to go back to the partner and kind of discuss that you had to change a lot of things and delay sort of the dates and everything else. Is it having sort of the ability to quickly identify those kind of issues as such to come to that resolution at the end?
Yeah, exactly. If you come from the software development originally, I
Mm,
think you get a good understanding of, how much effort certain things are that you don't have when you have never developed software, I think, because
yeah.
sometimes you see a very simple, check box on the UI, right, on the
Yeah.
front end. But
Yeah.
in the end, actually, there's a lot of, business logic or software behind it that
Mm.
that you don't see if you just see this front end checkbox, right? So,
Yeah.
and on the other hand, things that look great or something like that could actually be very simple to develop, just
Yes.
for the looks, that could be, you know, non-technical people, let's say like this,
Mm.
they wouldn't understand. They would maybe say the thing that looks better is also more complicated to develop, or more
Mm.
with more effort.
Yeah.
But this might not always be the case, and when then sometimes business stakeholders describe a process, yeah, and then we do this and this, and it's very easy,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you as an IT the person, you think, oh my God, this will be so hard.
Yeah, that is very true.
Yeah,
You have to consider it from all angles, I guess. I
yeah,
guess
exactly,
that's where
and
communication is key, like you mentioned.
it is exactly, and then it is key to explain
Mm.
uh, why, okay, this really takes much longer than if we do it the other way, for
Yeah.
example. So this you need
Mm.
to explain. You need to find the right words to explain to the business side.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah, yeah,
Definitely. It's about educating both sides really. But firstly, your
exactly.
position, kind of identifying first, okay, what direction should we head into? What would be the best for the company, or, to ensure that this product release is a success. So when you have all of those points, then I guess you then have to think about, okay, how can I communicate this in a way that the developers would understand and agree with, and vice versa, same on the business side. Am I right in sort of saying that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, it was really
Um,
interesting to have your insight on that. Obviously, as you mentioned, on the developer side, they can make or build software, and as you mentioned, there could be bugs in terms of using it, etc. So it's not always straightforward. And I know another point you identified early on was the fact that it's very common to have offshore developer teams. So ensuring the communication, obviously you have your language barriers, and making sure you communicate the plan clearly to them so that they deliver on their part, and then obviously do the same on the business side, is crucial, I guess you could say, in the process. So how do you kind of manage that? Say if a situation like that were to come up, how do you manage that well?
So in that, for for remote teams, it's very important. It's
Mm,
even more important that you write a good specification, or
yes.
can also be user stories. In the agile world, we would probably call it user stories.
Yeah.
But it's it's very important, even more important, that you describe the things very literally, very
Yeah.
exact,
Okay.
because otherwise there will always be misunderstandings, and you have to
Mm,
always question. Or what I always do is have someone else review it,
mm-hmm.
because even someone else next to you will maybe not understand what you just wrote there, or
Yeah.
not exactly, not exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
And that is important, is exactly. Otherwise, it I mean, it also happens to me all many times. It's normal that you create a specification, and then you think, man, I mean, that's clear to me,
Yeah,
I know
it's
I know
very
what I
true.
mean, right?
Yeah.
But
How
the
can
other
they
person
not?
will exactly, the other person will say, okay, but what in this case and what in that case? Okay, yeah,
Yes. It's always going to be
yeah,
different. Mm.
exactly. So that's important. And I mean, we have learned it now during the pandemic. Remote work has a few more extra challenges.
Mm.
And with these, even before the pandemic, I had this with the developing teams already, these
Yeah.
issues that
Mm-hmm.
you have to have, checkpoints, regular checkpoints with them,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's a daily meeting or whatever. Um,
Yes.
that always helps to, not, if you see go something going in the wrong direction, to immediately correct the course,
Mm-hmm.
and talk to them frequently, the people that are working remote. Um, yeah, I think that's very important,
Yeah,
because
definitely.
otherwise it can be much more problematic if you only talk to them twice every 2 weeks or so, or
Yes.
like that.
That
Yeah,
would
twice
make
a month.
sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
then
That
you
then
will
you'd
be
see more.
surprised what
Yeah.
what is happening here.
Yeah. Oh, very true. I mean,
Yeah,
as I mentioned, it's interesting for me to hear, I guess you could say as the outsider in the equation, looking in where you're offering us the insight in terms of all the ins and outs that go on behind the scenes, I guess you could say.
yeah,
Now, it seems like regardless of whether the developer team onshore, offshore, the issue and tensions, just to use your word from earlier, is always going to be there regardless, because obviously you're
mhm,
going to have two contrasting sides of the business, and obviously the middleman and woman in the middle trying to manage all of the expectations realistically, obviously, and
yeah,
try and deliver something of value, which is obviously the key word of our podcast that we're using today. um,
yeah,
so the issues are always going to be there. I know I asked this earlier, but remove the product owner, the requirements engineer, and the business analyst completely out of the equation, just so we can sort of see more insight into that.
mhm.
How do you see that process sort of operating if you were to remove that middleman?
Oh, yeah. That, I mean,
That response says it itself.
um, I mean, then I would lose my job, so I cannot speak for that. No, okay. I mean, if we imagine a world like that, when I was studying business information systems, there was already that. I mean, that was a long time ago, 12 years ago. But I already they already always had these nice ideas or visions of the future, where there are no developers needed anymore, because you can have these process engines that where
Yeah.
you can just business people can just plug move drag and drop the process pieces elements together and connect
Yeah.
them with arrows, and then
Hmm.
press build, and it's a working software.
Yeah.
um, yeah, there was this vision, right, with these BPM tools and so on, but until now it has not come to be. I mean, that's kind of thing. Now they're doing. I mean, now they are coming. They, or they take it down a level with these low code platforms,
Mm,
um, which is already closer to that. But you know, even there, you always need um, developers, and
yeah.
you will always need a person that is, that can understand both parts, and that has the
Yeah.
resource, and that has basically, as I said, right, a developer is really a specialized person, and
Mm,
he needs to focus, he or she needs to focus on the, create coding, creating software, good, creating good software
yeah.
architecture, testable. It's not you you cannot um, use your time then for discussions with the end customer or the business
Mm,
side. It's really because it's not a clear, straightforward discussion always.
yeah. No, very true.
As I
Yeah.
said, and also because the business side doesn't always understand the developer side, right?
Mm,
As I said, and I think it would be it would rather be like this, maybe AI, will
mm-hmm.
eventually maybe eventually replace us all, huh? But some first, in phases, yeah, I think first it might replace the developers,
Yeah.
and instead of the product owners or business analysts, because you
Yeah.
still need people to tell the AI what to build, and
Yes.
even an AI will need unambiguous description of that
Mm-hmm.
and
Definitely. Yeah.
specification. So nothing against developers, I was one too. So I'm not saying
Yeah.
they should be replaced. I just say this might be, because if you tell the computer or the AI
Mm,
what to do, exactly what to do, they will do exactly that.
yeah.
And the AI may think a little further.
Mm,
But still, knowing what the business means, what they really want, but sometimes even the business doesn't know what they actually want,
yeah. Yeah.
because they only know they have this idea in their head, this vision,
Mm,
but you need the practical people to bring them down to the what is possible, to the reality.
absolutely.
You know, I think that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's hard to
definitely.
imagine a world like that
Yeah,
without
it's hard to.
software.
That's why, I thought I'd propose it as if that ever, were the equation, because obviously I know that process needs to be in place within any company. You need to have the developers, as you mentioned, focus on their
Mhm.
coding and delivering usable software. Obviously, the business side of things, as well, kind of adding to the process, and then you have your product owner, etc., within the
Yeah,
middle, who
I
sets
mean,
these targets. I guess you could say that's received well on both ends. So I agree with that kind of format.
exactly. I mean, look, I'm working in a startup now, right?
Mm.
And in a startup, you will never have a role that is not useful, right?
Yes, yeah.
You have to save costs everywhere, so you
Mhm.
will everything that you can spare, every resource you can spare, you will spare. So
Mhm.
I would not be a product owner in a startup if this role was not valuable,
Mhm. Definitely.
Otherwise,
I
there would only be
agree.
the developers without me. And
Yes,
then and
yes.
then I think, yeah. So I think that already shows it.
Yeah, definitely. And there's
Mm,
different functions to each role, but all of which obviously, contribute to either the growth and success of the company, the product, whatever the case may be in this situation. So you
Yeah.
need those different factors,
Yeah.
essentially in any process. So that's why it was interesting for me to kind of hear what your take would be, given that you've been within this position for a number of years and within these types of processes, met a lot of challenges as well. I mean, the one that you mentioned to us earlier in the podcast, within that 2 months space of time, kind of highlights that, is a perfect example as to why these kind of processes are put into place. But obviously, in your case, you had a lot to balance in that situation and a lot of decisions to make. So that's very interesting. So you mentioned there the value, and that's exactly what we wanted to answer in this podcast. So, given all of the different factors that you've highlighted, the question to you really is then, what is sort of the value that product owners, business analysts, and requirements engineers, what do they carry? So that's kind of what we wanted to answer towards the end. So yeah, how would you kind of break that down and answer that?
So, I mean, after all that we've talked about, I think it's clear that,
Mm-hmm.
what any engineer creates, no matter software, hardware, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's only valuable if people use it or need it,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Want to use it or want to love to use it, want to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Otherwise it's only art, or I mean, art is also
Yeah.
useful, also
Yeah.
valuable, of course, but in a business sense, that is really the core thing. So that's what the product owner, business analyst, or requirements engineer
Mm-hmm.
facilitate. That
Yes.
that what the engineers create is actually valuable, used by people, and
Mm-hmm.
loved by people,
Yeah.
and creates value for the business. Yeah, I
Love
think
that.
that's it. Yeah.
That's a perfect summary. And I think the points that you've outlined throughout this podcast kind of provide sort of, add it all into one when you take them all into account. Definitely from my end, I do see great value in, say, product owners and business analysts, etc., within the company because of what they have to entail. So your example was perfect in terms of, your previous company or what you worked on previously. You were chucked into a situation that was the requirements, this was the end goal, but it's not as straightforward. And obviously you had to manage that. So really do appreciate that. And I have to thank you so much as well for sharing your insight. It's always good to have,
Sure.
a personal approach to it as well. So fantastic. Thank you so much, Stefan. I really did enjoy, speaking with you on the podcast. Thank you for joining me on episode 4 as well. And you shared
Sure.
a lot of
Thank you very
light.
much.
You're welcome. You shed a lot of light to some great topics. So, very valuable indeed, which I think we can take as the key word of today's podcast.